Lyra and her demon moved through the darkening hall, taking care to keep to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. The 3 great tables that ran the length of the hall were laid already, the silver and the glass catching what little light there was, and the long benches were pulled out ready for the guests. Portraits of former masters hung high up in the gloom along the walls. Lyra reached the dais and looked back to the open kitchen door, and seeing no one, stepped up beside the high table. The places here were laid with gold, not silver, and the 14 seats were not oak benches, but mahogany chairs with velvet cushions. Lyra stopped beside the master's chair and flicked the biggest glass gently with a fingernail. The sound rang clearly through the hall. "You're not taking this seriously," whispered her demon. "Behave yourself."
There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it is just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, the daytime temperatures hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake.
The rules of the Hunger Games are simple. In punishment for the uprising, each of the 12 districts must provide 1 girl and 1 boy called tribute to participate. The 24 tributes will be imprisoned in a vast outdoor arena that could hold anything from a burning desert to a frozen wasteland. Over a period of several weeks, the competitors must fight to the death. The last tribute standing wins.
"I don't give a tinker's toot what your mummy thinks," the Trunchbull yelled, and with that she lunged forward and grabbed the girl's pigtails in her right fist and lifted her clear off the ground. Then she started swinging her round and round, her head faster.
Stink by David Williams. Mr. Stink stank. He also stunk. And if it's correct English to say he stinked, then he stinked as well. He was the stinkiest stinker that ever lived. A stink is the worst type of smell. A stink is worse than a stench. And a stench is worse than a pong. And a pong is worse than a whiff. And a whiff can be enough to make your nose wrinkle. It wasn't Mr. Stink's fault that he stank. He was a tramp after all, and he didn't have a home, so he never had that opportunity to have a proper wash like me and you. After a while, the smell just got worse and worse.
King Fred the Fearless, Chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He'd announced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count 5 footmen and the boot boy. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, fine sweeping moustache, and looked magnificent in tight breeches, velvet doublets, and the ruffled shirts that the rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled and waved whenever he caught sight of anyone, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom to be hung in town halls.
The Coming of Caspar. Prince Caspar Kadinsky first came to the Savoy Hotel in a basket. I know because I was the one who carried him in. I carried all the Countess's luggage that morning, and I can tell you she had an awful lot of it.
In fairy tales, witches always wear silly black hats and black cloaks, and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a fairy tale. This is about real witches. The most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Never forget what is coming next. Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch.
Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the...
Chapter 1. A long-expected party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure.
When the doorbell rings at 3 a.m, it's never good news. Alex was woken by the first chime. His eyes flickered open, but for a moment he stayed completely still in his bed, lying on his back with his head resting on the pillow. He heard a bedroom door open and a creak of wood as somebody went downstairs. The bell rang a second time, and he looked at the alarm clock glowing beside him. There was a rattle as someone slid the security chain off the front door.
I disappeared on the night before my 12th birthday, July the 28th, 1988. Only now can I at last tell the whole extraordinary story, the true story. Kensuke made me promise that I would say nothing at all, until at least 10 years had passed. It was almost the last thing he said to me. I promised, and because of that I have had to live out a lie. I could let sleeping lies sleep on, but more than 10 years have passed now. I have done school, done college, and had time to think. I owe it to my family and to my friends, all of whom I have deceived for so long, to tell the truth about my long disappearance, about how I lived to come back from the dead. But there is another reason for speaking out now, a far, far better reason. Kensuke was a great man, a good man, and he was my friend. I want the world to know him as I knew him.
Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere.
Miss Cackles' Academy for Witches stood at the top of a high mountain surrounded by a pine forest. It looked more like a prison than a school, with its glorious grey walls and turrets. Sometimes you could see the pupils on their broomsticks flitting like bats above the playground wall, but usually the place was half hidden in mist, so that if you had glanced up at the mountain, you would probably not have noticed the building was there at all. Everything about the school was dark and shadowy. There were long, narrow corridors and winding staircases.
September, Tuesday. First of all, let me get something straight. This is a journal, not a diary. I know what it says on the cover, but when Mum went out to buy this thing, I specifically told her to get one that didn't say diary on it. Great, all I need is for some jerk to catch me carrying this book around and get the wrong idea. The other thing I want to clear up right away is that this was Mum's idea, not mine. But if she thinks I'm going to write down my feelings in here or whatever, she's crazy. So just don't expect me to be all dear diary this and dear diary that.